Well, thank you, Josie, and thank you all for braving the weather and coming out tonight. This is, I think we possibly could have picked a better night, but I'll blame that one on Josie. That was not any of my doing, so. Now, I will start off with a word of warning. When I compiled all the information I wanted to share with you all this evening, the first time I went through it and timed it, I spoke for an hour and a half. So I hope you all are comfortable. We might be here a while. So I'm just kidding, Josie. Don't get mad at me. Yeah, so last year when Josie was compiling this lecture topics for this year, she called me into her office one day and pitched me this idea, as she mentioned, and then she ended up, when I told her that, and I agreed that I probably did know somebody who might be interested in doing this topic, she said, well, you know, when I think of outlaws, scalawags, renegades, or scoundrels, there's only one person that comes immediately to mind. So I said, I'm so touched. Those are exactly the type of characters every girl longs to be associated with. So. But before you can really start looking at the outlaws that the Civil War, the outlaw gangs that the Civil War spun off, you kind of have to take a flip back and understand the guerrilla warfare that was going on during the Civil War, to kind of understand how that same mindset continued on after the war and kind of manifested itself in the Wild West. So irregular warfare in the Civil War, you have those who are somewhat associated with the organized military, and cavalry raiders kind of in the borderland area, Kentucky and everything, were probably the most closely associated. And then you had partisan rangers who were free to and independent enough to act on their own, but they still kind of answered to the organized military. They were at least, they kind of had the blessing of the government, and John Mosby would fall under those. Those were kind of the more civilized version of irregular warfare. Underneath that, you had guerrilla warfare, and really that was all across the South. And when I say guerrilla warfare, I mean, let's see if we can do this. When I say guerrilla warfare, I mean that it's more people taking up arms for themselves and just kind of fighting. Now, some of them may have done it because they were in a kill or be killed situation. Others just kind of used the chaos of the war as an opportunity to do whatever the heck they wanted to. Just kind of like, you know what? Cool, nobody's here to stop me, so I'm gonna go and I'm gonna take this from you. Or maybe I've never liked you. I'm just gonna go shoot you and be done with you. And so there's a lot of that going on. And then there were some who did kind of fight with a political cause in mind. They just were, they didn't want to join the organized army because that would mean leaving home. They wanted to stay home and protect their family. And so in their minds, they were fighting for a political cause. They were just kind of doing it on their own. And so all of those fell into that category of guerrilla warfare. And while you did see that all across the South, it was mostly concentrated in a couple of areas. You see it in the mountain area here, Appalachia, up in western Virginia on down into Georgia. And then you also saw it in the Ozark Mountains here in this area, Missouri to Arkansas. And then it was really prevalent and concentrated here on the frontier, Missouri, Kansas, where it had existed even before the war, obviously. But and again, that was just, if you research the topic, it's just an absolute mess. And it really was a free-for-all. And some of those ways that they fought continued on until after the war. But before you can understand what it morphed into after the war, you have to understand that this mindset actually existed even before the war. When the British Army in the Revolutionary War landed in South Carolina and started marching north to Virginia, they encountered guerrilla warfare and guerrilla fighter after guerrilla fighter. And the most well-known of those would be the Swamp Fox, Francis Marion, but he was not the only one that they encountered. They basically dealt with guerrillas the entire way up into Virginia. And then on the frontier, you had Bleeding Kansas. You've got the whole fight over the settlements making the states between Kansas and Missouri, and then the fight over should they be a slave state or not. And you have people like John Brown who just kill people who disagree with him because he can. And so a lot of this you could see even before the war. Now, Appalachia had been settled by those with Scotch-Irish roots, and so that created a culture that was filled with endemic violence and retributive justice, where individuals were the guardians of their own interests and self-sovereignty kept the order. And so because of that, that's the mindset, the culture they're coming from. And the war really presented an opportunity for that concept to multiply unrestrained. Law and order started breaking down, and so now suddenly what's already there is really bubbling up to the surface. Additionally, you now have a bunch of weapons in circulation that were manufactured for the war, and so it's a lot easier to really get your hand on a weapon or multiple weapons. And so all of that went into it as well. Now, a historian named Casey Terfatiller he actually wrote a book about something a little bit later than what we're discussing tonight, but he noted that shock value always has a longer shelf life than tedious detail. And that is really true about the guerrilla warfare during the war and the outlaw stories after the war. Because these stories were so violent and just kind of shocking to people that they were passed down from generation to generation, and many of them grew legendary. And eventually local amateur historians would be the ones to capture these accounts, but they just captured them. They did very little to actually verify their accuracy or curb the mythology that had been interwoven into them. And so it's tricky to kind of sort fact from fiction in both the guerrilla warfare during the war and then what it morphed into after the war with the outlaw stories. So that's something to kind of keep in mind as you hear information about some of these things. It's kind of like, okay, how much of it is actually true and how much of it is just speculation or grew out of that truth? Many of these outlaw stories have become legends, and these outlaws have taken on a larger-than-life persona, and a lot of the stories have really been romanticized as well. And it's kind of an example of this. You can see it's kind of hard to find fact from fiction. In Arkansas, in Stone County, there's a legend about the Hess brothers who, they say, robbed a U.S. mint and made their way to Stone County where a posse caught up with them. And shootout occurred. The Hess brothers were killed. When their bodies were examined, there was no gold on them. So there's a legend in Stone County that somewhere in those hills, all this gold that was robbed is hidden. Is it there or not? Who knows? But legend says that it is. And so, again, it can be kind of hard sometimes to know what exactly is true and what exactly isn't. So in Appalachia after the war, Champ Ferguson was probably the most well-known guerrilla during the war. He fought some with the organized troops, but he was really, really cruel and really murdered more than simply fighting in war. And after the war, he became only one of 2 former Confederates who were executed for war crimes. But he, however, was definitely not the only person fighting the guerrilla warfare in that area. I actually wrote a 150-page master's thesis on the guerrilla warfare in Western Virginia during the Civil War. And so if you need some reading material, feel free to Google my name and guerrilla warfare, and you need to fall asleep at night, start reading it, guaranteed to put you right to sleep or your money back. But now what's interesting to me is that if you start reading about Appalachia in the late 19th century, early 20th century, especially kind of the moonshining that went on then, it's interesting that some of those stories that you read about moonshiners fighting the law enforcement officers sound eerily like the stories of guerrillas fighting the soldiers during the war. And so it seems to me that this mindset that took place for the guerrilla warfare during the war started manifesting itself, or showed again at least, once the moonshiners really got going and were trying to be clamped down. Another thing that happened in Appalachia after the war were many family feuds got started during the war. So many bushwhackers in that area had operated around the town where they were from, and so they were known. Everybody knew who they were, and so their descendants were feared and hated in the family lore of their opponents because they never left the area. Richard Curry and Gerald Ham were 2 historians who studied Appalachia and the guerrilla warfare there, and they concluded that there is no doubt that guerrilla warfare intensified the spirit of lawlessness, intolerance, and partisan vindictiveness that characterized the Reconstruction era in that region. Now, across the South, you also have vigilante groups springing up after the war, and that same mindset that had given rise to do what you need to do in the war that manifested itself in guerrilla warfare now suddenly became manifested in vigilante groups like the Red Shirts or the Klan. And those vigilante groups became the paramilitary wing of the Democratic Party, and that Democrats would use them for widespread systematic violence if they felt an immediate threat to their grasp of power once they regained the power following when Reconstruction kind of fizzled out and the Republicans lost the political power there in the South. In Arkansas especially, the guerrilla warfare had been pretty brutal, and it kind of spilled over into post-war politics, and that was and also very clearly into race relations. And it kind of culminated in the 1888 election, which was one of the most corrupt in Arkansas history. John Clayton, who you can see here on the screen, was the Republican candidate for the 2nd Congressional District, and he ended up losing the election by 846 votes out of over 34,000 cast. Now, you can say, oh, that's just terrible luck, but it was more than luck. In Plumerville in Conway County, as the votes were being gathered in the ballot box, 4 masked and armed white men broke into the voting precinct and stole the ballot box at gunpoint. Now, that area of town was the predominantly African-American area, and therefore most of those votes would have been for Clayton, and probably would have been enough to push him over and win the general election. Well, Clayton hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency from Chicago to investigate this. In that town, there was a deputy sheriff named Oliver Bentley, and he had a brother who threatened to talk to the Pinkertons. Now, this would have been very awkward for Deputy Bentley, considering it was probably him who stole the ballot box, and his brother would have known that. And so Bentley killed his brother. And he invented a story saying, oh, there's an accidental discharge of the gun. Well, it's a pretty bad accident when somebody is shot 5 times. And so the death, however, was officially ruled an accident. So Clayton decided to go to Plumerville himself to investigate, even though he was warned, hey, look, it's probably too dangerous for you there. He went anyway. And on January 29th of 1889, he was seated at a table in a boarding house getting ready to write a letter to his children when somebody shot him through a window with a shotgun. And it was described as it hit him so squarely that his brains were burst about the room, and it blew his head off, is what it was said. It was more than likely either Deputy Bentley or Bob Pate, who was a local saloon owner, who did the killing. Now, fortunately enough for them, Bentley was the one who headed the investigation of the murder, and Bob Pate was on the coroner's jury. And so, unsurprisingly, they concluded that Clayton had been murdered, quote, at the hands of unknown persons. They claimed, okay, there was a man who lived out in California who'd been bitter enemies with Clayton for the last 20 years. We think he might have traveled and killed him. That sounds good, right? Unfortunately, he was so old by this point, he was kind of crippled and confined to his bed, so he couldn't really make the trip. And then they also stated that they'd received a letter from somebody in London who had kind of hinted towards the fact that Jack the Ripper was the one who traveled from London and made this murder. To add really insult to injury, the lady who ran the boarding house where Clayton was murdered actually presented Clayton's family with a bill for the damages her boarding house sustained, because she said that his blood stained her carpet, and she took a loss on that. And so Republicans really were not given any sympathy whatsoever in Arkansas. Interestingly enough, Clayton was later declared the winner of the election, and so they had to do another election because the seat was left vacant. And his assassin was never found. Deputy Bentley later became the justice of the peace, and he presided over a trial in which they put a man on trial for the murder from Minnesota. By that point, the man had been dead for 2 years, and Bentley found him guilty and said, case closed. They didn't look into it any further. And so that's kind of one story of how this idea of we can just take matters into our own hands manifested itself in Arkansas. But in Arkansas, where it was really tied to organized politics, out west, it was more of the men who made their own law, or they disregarded the laws that were in place. And Michael Feldman is a historian who wrote Inside War, which is really the definitive work on guerrilla warfare during the Civil War. And he concluded that most rural white Missourians lost a great deal during the war. Male kin, property, security, decent communal relations, all building blocks of a normal life. They had to lie and cheat and bear false witness just to survive. So how do you pack up from that and move on once the war is over? It's just, it's not easy. There were some people who tried. There were others who had lost everything, and they ended up moving away. A great many Missourians moved down to Texas immediately after the Civil War ended. And then there were those who didn't even try. They just decided to take the law into their own hands, keep doing what they had been doing. And many of those who went that route had fought under one of two men during the war. William Quantrill was one of the most notorious guerrillas of the Civil War. He was known for the massacre at Lawrence, Kansas, where he and his men slaughtered hundreds of innocent civilians simply because it was a Union town, a Union-backed town, and the Union senator liked to go there a lot. He and his men killed Union soldiers and Unionists without distinction. They did not distinguish between civilian or combat. They just kind of killed anybody who they wanted to. Quantrill himself was killed before the war ended, but his band did not disband. The other one was Bloody Bill Anderson. He was one of the most brutal guerrillas of the war. He actually started as a lieutenant under Quantrill, but he concluded that Quantrill was not vicious enough, so he broke off and had his own group. He was also killed before the war ended, and following the war, many of Anderson's men kind of banded together with Quantrill's men, and they kept their own groups. One of those men was Archie Clement, who was known as Anderson's head devil or Anderson's head demon. He was a small man. He was only 5 feet tall. He weighed 130 pounds, so he was known as Little Archie. But he was a consummate killer who was ferocious, and he liked to scalp his victims. He was only 17 years old when he became a lieutenant in Anderson's company, and after Anderson's death, he was the one who took command of the band. He didn't even try to surrender at the end of the war. He just had no interest in doing so, and he began robbing banks. In fact, he joined the James gang, which we'll get to later, and he helped him on their first robbery. And as well as Frank and Jesse James are still kind of known, authorities originally just suspected Clements and didn't even turn their attention to the James brothers until a while later. At the election of 1866, Clement took a gang of 100 members of Quantrill's former and Anderson's former gangs, and they attacked the town of Lexington, Missouri on Election Day, and they managed to intimidate the town enough that the Republican Party was defeated in the general election. When the Missouri State Militia came to counter them, Clements just faded into the hills, and which is exactly the same type of strategy that was used in guerrilla warfare all the time during the war. On December 13th of that year, for some reason, Clements decided it would be funny, it'd be a big joke to try to enlist his own men in the Missouri State Militia. So he goes back into Lexington, and the head of the militia allowed him to come in because they didn't want to just start out this fight in the city streets. So he signed up his men, and he peacefully leaves. But then he circles back and went to the city hotel, where he's having a drink, and the militia heard he was there, so they sent men to arrest him for bank robbery, and he starts a gunfight. He gets on his horse, tries to make it out of town, but he was shot off his horse, and he was mortally wounded. When the soldiers approached him, though, he was still trying to cock his revolver with his mouth so he could get off one last shot before he died. And a soldier approached him and said, "Arch, you're dying. What do you want me to do with you?" And he responded, "I've done what I always said I would do, die before surrender." And that he did. And you have Quantrill's group as well, who didn't disperse. Since Quantrill's and Anderson's men were guerrillas rather than legitimate soldiers, they were denied the general amnesty that was given to the Confederate army after the war ended. So many of the gangs stayed together for means of force and protection, and some, like Frank and Jesse James, took this as an excuse to become criminals and bank robbers. You have the James brothers up there on the left. Frank is on the left, and Jesse's to the right of him. The James Younger gang became probably the most notorious in American history, and members of that gang came and went, but the James and Younger brothers remained the central power structure of that gang. Frank and Jesse had a very normal childhood. Their parents met at a revival in Kentucky. Their father later became a Baptist minister in Missouri. And Frank was the oldest child. Their next child died as an infant, and then Jesse was born, and then they had a younger sister. When she was an infant and Jesse was 3, their father was invited to go to California with a wagon train that was leaving from that area of men who wanted to go to California to look for gold. And they invited their father to go along as the chaplain. So he accepted, but he never made it home. He contracted a fever in California and died of cholera. So their mother remarried to a well-to-do doctor, whose last name was Samuel. And Dr. Samuel was the one who taught both boys how to ride and how to shoot horses. As a child, Frank was said to be withdrawn and a Bible reading boy who had a great interest in his late father's sizable library, particularly Shakespeare. And Jesse was noted to be generous, noble-hearted, and assertive. So they really had a normal family life. There was nothing that would have made you guess what they would have later become. Frank really desired higher education. He was looking forward to going to college, but when he turned 18, the Civil War broke out. And so he enlisted in the Missouri State Guard, which was a Confederate unit, because he supported the Confederacy. He fought with that guard in a couple of battles, and then he returned home. It was either due to injury or illness. But while he was home, he was arrested by the local militia, who were Union sympathizers, and they refused to let him go until he signed an oath of allegiance. Well, that signing the oath meant he could no longer fight in the organized forces of the Confederacy. He, however, did not want to let the war pass him by without doing his part, and so he joined Quantrill's men in July of 1862. 3 months after the raid on Lawrence, Kansas that I mentioned earlier, Union soldiers invaded the Samuel family farm and wanting to know information about Quantrill's location. They questioned Jesse, who was 15 at the time. He refused to tell them anything, so they horsewhipped him. And they took Dr. Samuel and they strung him up and hung him from a tree in the backyard. The doctor actually survived the ordeal, but the whole experience left Jesse very embittered, very angry, and so he joined Anderson's guerrilla forces the next year when he was 16 years old. After the war, Jesse actually tried to ride into Lexington, Kansas, with a white flag to surrender, but the Union soldiers there shot at him. They wounded him, so he actually went to Nebraska for a little while he recovered before he was able to come back. Now, interestingly enough, those who knew him at that time described him as a very reliable young man who was always dressing well and reading his Bible and regularly attending church. They said he never swore or took the Lord's name in vain, but he preferred when he was angry to make his own swear words up. His favorite was Dingus, which his brother Frank promptly nicknamed him because he thought it was so funny. But Jesse claimed that he had been forced into a life of crime because of what his family had suffered during the war. And so after the war, he turned to outlawry. Then you have the younger brothers, 4 of the 14 younger siblings are pictured there on the right. Cole Younger was the 7th of the 14 younger children. He supported the Confederacy, even though their father supported the Union. Cole actually became part of Quantrill's men, and he served in the regular Confederate Army as well later, and was made a captain there. When he returned home after the war, though, he found the family home in ruins. And he was very embittered over that. He continued to associate with some of his old comrades from the war, and so very quickly he joined with the James brothers, and began what he claimed was taking revenge against Yankee capitalist banks and railroads. His brother Jim was a bushwhacker the entire war under Quantrill. And after the war, he had a number of jobs, including being the deputy sheriff in Dallas County, Texas, from 1870 to 1871. By 1873, however, he had joined his brother as part of the James gang. And Bob Younger was the youngest brother. He was child 13 out of 14. He was too young to fight with Quantrill, which meant he was at home and he witnessed firsthand his father killed by Union soldiers and his home burned to the ground. And so as soon as his brother Cole joined with the James brothers after the war, he joined the gang as well. Their first bank robbery occurred on February 13th of 1866. They robbed the Clay County Savings Association in Liberty, Missouri, and made off with $60,000 in cash and bonds. It was by far their most lucrative bank robbery of their career. This robbery was the first daylight, peacetime armed bank robbery in U.S. history. Now, during their escape, gunfire erupted, and an innocent 17-year-old bystander was killed. And this actually kind of set a precedence for the James Younger gang because innocent bystanders were often killed during their bank robberies. Soon, however, they tired of robbing only banks. Part of that was that banks had started to install time lock vaults, and so it was a lot harder to rob them. And so they began turning their focus on railroads and stagecoaches as well, because those carried large shipments of money. Their first train heist was July 21st of 1873, when they robbed the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad while it was traveling in Iowa. 5 members of the gang pulled some track up, and when the train hit that, it derailed and overturned, and the locomotive engineer was actually killed in that. Now, it was said that the James Younger gang lived by the horse and died by the horse. Those who had fought with Quantrill during the war had learned the importance of having a good horse, and Jesse James especially had developed into an expert horseman. He believed that the best mounted man often won because it allowed them to easily outmaneuver and outrun anybody who was pursuing them. William Cody, or Buffalo Bill, allegedly told authorities, quote, "That's why the James brothers are making fools of you. They ride superior horses." Jesse actually imported many of his from Kentucky because he wanted thoroughbred horses. They had great stamina and they were very well schooled, so they remained calm even if gunfire broke out. One of his favorite horses, actually his favorite horse, name was Stonewall, named for Stonewall Jackson, and he actually took a picture with it in 1875. It's the only picture of Jesse James with a horse that exists. In 1874, both Jesse and Frank got married, and they retired from their outlaw life for a while, lived near Nashville, Tennessee, and Jesse became a respected citizen of the area and got involved in horse racing there and even rode in many of the races. However, there was no national network at the time, so catching the outlaws proved to be a very hard task since they were so hard to track. The Missouri governor had hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency to look for them. And the Pinkertons were pretty upset they had not been able to arrest even a single member of the gang, and so even though the gang had kind of stopped, they continued hunting for them. And they thought they had tracked Jesse and Frank to the home of their mother and stepfather. The James brothers, however, were not there. The Pinkertons did not know that. They surrounded the cabin. They tossed in an explosive device. They claimed it was only a smoke bomb, but those inside the cabin saw something smoking, and so they tossed it into the fire. Now, those inside the cabin were Frank and Jesse's mother, their stepfather, and their 9-year-old half-brother. The device exploded. It killed their half-brother, and it blew the arm off of their mother. And she had to have it amputated. Her arm was so mangled. This made the James brothers absolutely livid. They took revenge on the neighbor who had allowed the Pinkertons to stay on their farm and kind of spy out the James farm. And this also made them return to outlawry full-time, where they continued to rob all sorts of things. Now, the demise of the James Younger gang occurred at Northfield, Minnesota bank robbery. They attempted to rob this bank on September 7th of 1876. Jesse and Frank James, with Bob Younger, went inside the bank, while Cole and Jim Younger stayed outside with 3 other members of the gang, Bill Chadwell, Clell Miller, and Charlie Pitts. They stood guard outside. Those inside of the bank demanded that the vault be opened so they could take the money. The clerk refused, so they shot him and killed the man. However, that turned out to be their demise because that gunshot alerted the citizens of the town that there was a bank robbery going on. And so they all rushed and took up their arms and started shooting at those outlaws who were outside of the bank. Miller and Chadwell were killed, and Cole Younger was wounded. He was hit in the thigh. By this point, Frank and Jesse and Bob Younger had fled from the bank, and Bob, as he was running, was shot in the elbow. So the gang took off. They were pursued by posses, and they eventually split up. The Younger brothers and Charlie Pitts went one direction. The James brothers went the other direction. The posse ended up catching the Younger brothers near Madelia, Minnesota on September 21st. That's over 400 miles away from where they robbed the bank. A gunfight erupted, and Charlie Pitts was killed, and all 3 of the Younger brothers were wounded even further. But finally, they surrendered. So the 3 men who were killed in this robbery, Clell Miller was only 14 years old when he joined Anderson's band during the Civil War. His only time in combat was in actually the skirmish where Anderson was killed. He was captured, but he was not killed due to his young age. He was sent to prison. His father managed to claim that the family had always supported the Union and was able to get him out of prison. He joined the James gang and was eventually involved in 11 robberies. But the reason he joined was he was actually accused of being part of a robbery, which he claimed he wasn't, and he was acquitted on it. But he later said that, quote, he might as well just join them because his reputation had been ruined by the trial. And then there was Bill Chadwell from Minnesota. He was the one who had suggested the gang go up to Minnesota to rob the banks because he said he could easily get the men in and out of the state. He clearly had miscalculated. And the final one was Charlie Pitts, whose real name was Sam Wells. He'd been a childhood friend of the James brothers and fought with Quantrill. He was 28 years old when he was killed. He was married and had 2 children. During the shootout, when the posse had cornered them, Cole Younger later said he had told Charlie he could surrender when his evident they couldn't escape, but that Charlie had replied, "I'll not go. I can die as well as you can." And he said as soon as he said that, he was shot through the heart. So the younger brothers were tried and found guilty of murder and sentenced to 25 years in state prison. Bob Younger died in prison in 1889. Jim was pardoned in 1901, but the next year he committed suicide. And the reason he did that was he'd fallen in love with a newspaper writer named Alice Miller, but his parole terms had been so strict he was not permitted to marry. Cole was also pardoned in 1901, and he lived until 1916. He actually received an official pardon in 1903, at which point he was reunited with Frank James, and they toured on a Wild West show for a while. After that, he went on the lecture circuit preaching the evils of crime. In 1903, he published an autobiography where he portrayed himself as a Confederate avenger rather than an outlaw. And in his last years, he was known as an elderly church-goer where because he said he had converted and become a Christian, and he died quietly in his sleep. The arrest of the Younger brothers signaled the end of the James Younger gang. During their 15-year crime spree, the gang had committed 26 holdups and made off with more than $200,000 and killed at least 17 men. Now, meanwhile, the James brothers had escaped and made their way back to Missouri, where they eventually moved on back to Nashville, Tennessee, and lived peaceably for the next 3 years. However, Jesse started up a new gang in 1879. He grew a little bit restless, and they again committed robberies throughout Missouri, Kentucky, Iowa, Arkansas, Kansas, and even into West Virginia. The governor of Missouri eventually had stepped outside of the law and put together a large reward to try to stop this. He couldn't use state funds for that reward, and so he actually got the railroad companies to put up the money, since it would help benefit them to catch Jesse James. And the reward was large enough it made one of the gang members turn traitor. When Jesse was 34 years old, his wife, he's there on the right, his wife pleaded with him to live a more normal life. And he agreed that sounded good, but first he wanted to commit one last robbery because he said that would permit him to retire and live the life of a gentleman farmer after he got this money. So he began planning it with Bob and Charles Ford. Bob Ford is here on the right. On April 3rd, 1882, they were in Jesse's cabin planning this robbery when Jesse noticed that a needlework on the wall was crooked. It was one his mother had stitched. And so he pulled a chair over and stood on the chair to straighten it. And he heard a cocking of the pistol. Bob Ford had cocked his pistol, so Jesse turned his head to look at him. And as he turned his head, Bob shot him. The bullet entered right below his right ear. He was killed instantly. His wife and children were in the next room. They came rushing into the room to see what had happened. Bob fled immediately. His brother Charles was also there. Charles stuck around for a minute or two, trying to convince them that the pistol had gone off accidentally. And then he eventually just turned and ran as well. Now, interestingly enough, the picture that's here in the middle shows Bob Ford and Jesse James together. Last October, a woman came forward and said that her grandmother this was a family picture that they were handing down. And she claimed that, this was a real picture. Somebody from the Houston Police Department, who does all of their facial recognition analyzation, took a look at it and concluded that this is a legitimate photo. A couple of the James brothers historians, however, don't really like the idea of Robert Ford and Jesse James being in a picture together, and they're claiming it's a fraud. So there's a lot of uproar over whether or not this is actually a real picture, and it's going on right now. So it's kind of interesting. I wanted to show that to you all. After Rob Ford murdered Jesse James, the Ford brothers expected to be treated as heroes, but instead they got public abuse because it seemed like such a cowardly way to kill Jesse James. They killed him for two reasons. The first one was the $10,000 reward. That sounded pretty good to him. And the second one was Bob Ford had actually been accused of murder, and Governor Crittenden of Missouri had agreed that he would pardon him from that murder if he'd killed Jesse James. And so he took him up on that offer. Ford was charged with the murder of Jesse, but true to his word, the governor pardoned him of both murders. The brothers, however, only ended up getting a fraction of the reward money. 3 months later, Frank James surrendered to the governor. He had tired of the outlaw life and wanted to try to settle down and live a normal life. The public offered such universal sympathy that even though Frank underwent several long trials, he was acquitted of all crimes. So he returned to the James farm, and he worked as a horse trainer and actually started a racetrack. And he lived to be 72 when he died of natural causes. Now, the James brothers' most outspoken defender was really the one who allowed them to have such a long career and to be remembered as they are. This is Virginia-born newspaper editor John Newman Edwards. He was General Shelby's adjunct during the war, and after the war, he helped found the Kansas City Times and served as its editor. He wrote colorful and fiery editorials to persuade ex-Confederates to return to politics. The Confederates had been banished from holding office at the end of the war, and he was trying to reverse that. He used his newspaper to provide alibis and excuses for the James brothers. He made them out to be symbols of ex-Confederates striking back against perceived corruption, graft, oppression, and the criminality of the Republican rule in Missouri, and he kind of created a folk hero status for them. When Jesse was killed in 1882, Edwards wrote a flattering obituary, and he was actually the one who arranged for Frank James to be able to surrender to the governor, and he didn't know he was going to be fully acquitted, but without too much backlash there. His flattering treatment of Jesse James undoubtedly formed the basis of the heroic legend that's still associated with the outlaw. Part of that obituary reads, "No one among all the hired cowards, hard on the hunt for blood money, dared face this wonderful outlaw, one even against 20, until he had disarmed himself and turned his back to his assassins, the first and only time in a career which has passed from the realms of an almost fabulous romance into that of history. We call him outlaw, and he was, but fate made him so." And later he continued, "When the war closed, Jesse James had no home. Prescribed, hunted, shot, driven away from among his people, a price put upon his head, what else could the man do with such a nature except what he did do? He had to live. It was his country. The graves of his kindred were there. He refused to be banished from his birthright, and when he was hunted, he turned savagely about and hunted his hunters. Would to God he were alive today to make a righteous butchery of a few more of them." This is an editorial in a newspaper. It kind of shows you how times have changed. This claim, though, that the James brothers were forced to become an outlaw, to me, it doesn't really hold water. There are numerous examples of those who fought in the war, under Quantrill even, who chose not to become an outlaw after the war. One was Alan Parmer. He joined Quantrill's gang when he was 15, and he was wounded 5 times during the war. After the war, though, he attended Bryant and Stratton's Business College in St. Louis. He married, in 1970, he married Susan James, the younger sister of Frank and Jesse, and they had 4 children. He was a farmer and a stock raiser, and he wandered around a bit and dabbled in business a little bit. But I bring him up to say you would think if somebody had to become an outlaw, it would be somebody who fought with Quantrill during the war, liked wandering a bit, and married into the James family. But he died in 1927 of a heart attack. And so he lived a life on the right side of the law following the war. Then there was also Captain William Gregg, who also fought under Quantrill. After the war, he became a prominent farmer and deputy sheriff of Jackson County, Missouri. He did write a manuscript on Jesse James and served as one of the pallbearers for John and Cole Younger, so he kept up his old war associations. But for the rest of his life, he was a law-abiding citizen and a deputy sheriff. And so, were they forced to become one? I would call that into question a little bit. Some of the other outlaws, though, who became famous at the time, there was Jim Cummings Clark, who I think has an interesting story. The Encyclopedia of Western Gunfighters lists his occupations as thief, soldier, laborer, and law officer. Because why not? When he was 17, he stole a mule from his stepfather and fled to Texas, where he and a friend sold the mule, stole $1,400 from a rancher, and returned to Missouri. He became a trusted lieutenant for Quantrill during the war, and after the war he tried to surrender, but his surrender was not honored, so he returned to a life of thievery and wandering. Off and on, he joined the James gang, and in 1887 he moved to Telluride, Colorado, where he found work digging a pipeline into town. He then secured an appointment as a city marshal, and he enforced the law by clubbing ruffians with his fist. He was rumored to continue his criminal activities from time to time, though, and in 1889, Butch Cassidy and his band robbed the bank in that town of $20,000, and rumors spread that Clark had agreed for part of the loot, he would conveniently be out of town when they tried to rob the bank. This was never proven, but he was fired nonetheless, and he promptly began uttering threats to kill members of the city council. He offered to kill one for 15 cents or two for 25 cents, whichever you prefer. He remained in that town until he was shot to death on August 7th of 1895. He'd been walking down Main Street, and he was shot in the back. No real investigation ever took place. The killer was never discovered. Rumor said that several prominent businessmen wanted him gone, and therefore he was gone. And that was that. Now, was this really the man who'd fought under Quantrill and done some raids with Frank and Jesse James? Well, everybody seemed to think it was, except for Frank James, who allegedly said the man killed could not be Jim Cummings for a couple of reasons. One, he was too smart to become a city marshal. And two, quote, "You see, Jim was one of those men that won't let nobody shoot him." So there you have it. Arthur McCoy was another outlaw. He became known as the Wild Irishman under Joe Shelby. He'd been born in Ireland, and when he came to America, he went to California as a 49er in the goldfields. In December of 1855, he married Louisa Gibson, who was the youngest daughter of a well-to-do St. Louis family. They had two sons, one of whom died during the war as a very young child, and they had a daughter, Elizabeth, in 1861. Now, after the war, his life and his career get a little bit more hazy. He was supposedly a member of the James Younger gang, although he was a city boy, so it didn't really fit the mantra of some of the other members. But he did know John Jarrett, who served as a captain under Shelby and had a James connection, so that's probably who made that connection there. He was believed to have been one of those involved in the killing of a Pinkerton agent who was investigating the Jameses, and he was identified as one who participated in numerous robberies through the first half of the 1870s. He and his wife, however, in the 1870s had a farm in Missouri, and two more sons were born in the beginning of that decade to the family. According to family history, though, Arthur didn't like farming, so he went to Texas to see about getting into cattle and living there potentially. Legend now takes over where history has ended, and legends say he was arrested for a stage robbery near Austin, Texas. But by 1874-75, he had effectively vanished. Nobody really knows what had happened to him. By 1880, his wife had listed herself as a widow, and so presumably he died by that point. Now, the only reason I bring him up is to point out that not all outlaws had been guerrilla fighters, because McCoy was a city boy, he was a family man, and he had fought in the organized forces during the war. Yet he was a drifter. And so that kind of personality, what the James brothers had started, kind of just really appealed to him. And so he turned to that type of life after the war. And then there was Belle Starr. She was one ferocious woman. She was born Myra Maybelle Shirley in 1848, and her nicknames were the Outlaw Queen or the Bandit Queen. Her family supported the Confederacy. She had been educated at a girls' academy and trained to be a pianist, and she appeared to be on her way to a respectable middle-class life. Her older brother, though, John Addison, who was nicknamed Bud, had taught her to use guns and ride horses, and many believe she unofficially joined him on some of his raids with Quantrill during the war. Bud died in 1864, and by that point, Belle's father's business as an innkeeper was ruined, so the family moved to Texas for a fresh start. And it was at that point that Belle's life trajectory went from being a respectable middle-class woman to one who at least associated with outlaws, if not an outlaw herself. She married Jim Reed in 1866, and they had two children, Pearl and Eddie. Now, Jim Reed had grown up in Missouri and knew the Shirleys. He had joined Quantrill's raiders and also fled to Texas following the war, where he and Belle got married. By the time of Pearl's birth, he had become involved in the Tom Starr gang. They were cattle rustlers. He became a wanted man when he allegedly murdered somebody, and so he fled with his family to California. Now, shortly after Eddie's birth in 1871, they returned to Missouri, and Jim Reed rode off and on with both the James Younger gang and the Tom Starr gang. In April of 1874, he robbed the Austin San Antonio stage, and incidentally enough, Belle was named as an accessory on the indictment, but there was no evidence against her, and so they dropped the charge. Jim, however, was on the run, and a deputy sheriff cornered him and killed him at Paris, Texas in August of 1874. Belle sent her children to live with their grandparents, and again, legends taking over here, where we have no history, but it's traditionally believed that she herself was on the run from the law, and she drifted into Oklahoma Indian Territory, where she began to lead her own band of cattle and horse thieves, and therefore we have the Belle Starr gang. It was at this point she married Sam Starr, who was a Cherokee. And he was actually Tom Starr's son, the gang that her first husband had ridden with. They married in 1880, although legend says it might have only been a common law marriage, as had her first marriage to Jim Reed. So who actually knows? They lived on Cherokee land, though, and they built a house with where they would harbor outlaws often. In 1883, both Belle and Sam were convicted of stealing horses, and they both spent 9 months in jail in Detroit. Belle was now known as a felon, and she kind of dressed the part. She wore gold earrings and a man's hat with feathers and velvet skirts, and she rode a mare named Venus. She was arrested twice more, but never convicted for lack of evidence. In 1886, Sam was killed in a gunfight with an old enemy, and she remarried for the third time to a man named Bill July, who was also a Cherokee. Now, Bill July was 15 years younger than her, and she started calling him July Starr. So I don't know if he officially took that name, but that's what she called him. He, shortly after they were married, was summoned to Fort Smith, Arkansas, because he'd been accused of stealing a horse, and she accompanied him part of the way and then decided to turn back. And on her way home, as she was still right outside of Fort Smith, on February 3rd, 1889, she was just shy of her 41st birthday. She was shot in the back from 2 shotgun blasts. By this point in her life, she had many enemies, including her 2 children, Pearl and Eddie. So nobody really knows who could have killed her. Bill July believed it was a man named Edgar Watson, who had rented land from them, and he was a fugitive, however, who was wanted for murder. And apparently when Bill found out, she'd kicked him out of his house and sent him on his way. And so Watson was actually arrested on the suspicion he had murdered her, but since there were no witnesses, they couldn't prove anything, and so he was released. And it's still a mystery as to who actually killed Belle Starr. A couple more I wanted to highlight are the Farrington brothers, Hillary and Levi. They had both been Confederate guerrillas before the war, and like the James brothers, they decided that robbing banks seemed to be a good post-war occupation. And so they also robbed trains. And they robbed the Mobile and Ohio Railroad in Union City, Tennessee, in 1870. Well, the Pinkertons were hot on their tail, and Hillary Farrington actually shot William Pinkerton in the side when the detective had him cornered on a Kentucky farm. Pinkerton, however, was not killed. He managed to subdue Hillary and cuff him. The next day, they were en route to Columbus, Kentucky, on a paddle boat when Hillary broke loose and grabbed Pinkerton's shotgun. The gun discharged and grazed Pinkerton's skull, but again did not kill him. Hillary wrenched it free. Before he could actually aim at the detective, though, Pinkerton delivered an angry uppercut that sent Hillary flying backwards over the railing. He landed on the paddle wheel, and I bet you can guess what happened next. He was chopped to pieces. His brother, meantime, had been captured in Farmingdale, Illinois. He had been returned to Union City, Tennessee for the trial. However, there were many angry people in the town that this had happened, and while he was in prison awaiting his trial, a mob formed, broke into the prison, and took him out and lynched him. So these are some of the most notorious of the Wild West gangs. Now, outlaw gangs had existed before the war because the frontier was hard to police, and so those who liked to operate outside the boundaries of the law tended to be attracted to that area. However, those who had fought in the Civil War that we just covered and looked at really set a precedence for many who came later that really created the Wild West stories that we hear about. And I'm just going to briefly highlight a couple of them. The Doolin-Dalton gang was in operation for a year from 1891 to 92. The Dalton brothers had actually been U.S. deputy marshals in Fort Smith, Arkansas. But then they turned to a life of crime because they discovered that robbing trains and banks was actually an easier way to make a living than living on the right side of the law. However, the gang attempted a robbery in Coffeyville, Kansas, in October of 1892, and the gang members who were all involved in that robbery were all killed, after which this picture was taken as kind of proof that they were killed. Now, there are some members of the gang who weren't there, and that was including a man named Bill Doolin, and so he took the remaining members and he formed the Oklahombres. And for 3 years, that gang robbed banks, stagecoaches, and trains in Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. Doolin held something of a Robin Hood image and was well liked by many people, and so it was those people who actually helped him and his gang evade the law. The gang was dissolved, though, when Bill was tracked down and killed in 1896. Then there's Kid Curry, whose real name was Harvey Alexander Logan. He was known as the wildest in Butch Cassidy's outlaw gang known as the Wild Bunch. That gang also included the Sundance Kid, Will Carver, and many others. Some of them, including Kid Curry, posed for a photo in 1901, which I've put on the screen for you. funnily enough, the Pinkertons learned about the photo, got a copy of it, and put it on wanted posters all across America. So probably a bad idea for them to have posed for this photo. Kid Curry, during his lifetime, was wanted on warrants for 15 murders, but it was generally believed that he had murdered at least twice that number. And William Pinkerton called him the most vicious outlaw in America and said, quote, "He has not one single redeeming feature. He is the only criminal I know of who does not have one single good point."
Which one is he?
I am not sure. It's a good question. I tried to find the identities, but I just kept running into lists that all gave me different information, so I'm not positive, and I did not spend enough time looking into it to truly be able to answer that question. Then there was Cherokee Bill, whose real name was Crawford Goldsby. He was responsible for the murders of 7 men, and he and his gang terrorized the Indian Territory for 2 years. He was only 18 when he began his life of outlawry, and he and his group, called the Cook Group, robbed banks, stagecoaches, and stores, and were willing to shoot just about anybody who got in their way. He was caught in 1895. He was only 19 at the time he was caught. He was taken to Fort Smith, Arkansas. He was put on trial for 3 days, but the trial was predetermined. The result was predetermined. He was sentenced to hang on March 17th of 1896. He had just turned 20 at the time. He was scheduled to be hung at 11 o'clock, but that was delayed because his sister wanted to see him one last time, and her train was not due in until 1 p.m. And so he was hanged shortly after 2. He was asked if he had any last words, to which he replied, "I came here to die and not make a speech." And that's exactly what he did. And then there's Henry Starr. His uncle was the notorious Sam Starr, who was married to Belle. Henry was not at all fond of Belle. He found her to be crude and reprehensible, and he would quickly inform anybody who asked about the relationship that she was his aunt by marriage only. So you know you got to be a pretty interesting woman to be reviled like that by an outlaw like Henry Starr. He spent 32 years in crime. He claimed to have robbed more banks than both the James Younger gang and the Doolin Dalton gang put together. He started robbing banks on horseback in 1893 and robbed his last in a car in 1921. Allegedly, he robbed 21 banks during his outlaw career and made off with nearly $80,000, all on his own. So, now the legend has really romanticized many outlaws, especially the James brothers, through originally dime novels and editorials, like we heard earlier. And then later, I think through TV shows and movies. It's really how most people in the public know about these men. And a lot of them have become these Robin Hood type figures versus the evil lawmen. And although we did hear about quite a few, I call them pretty evil lawmen, it is interesting that that's kind of the typical way that Wild West outlaws have been characterized. And so I want to leave you with this thought. The Encyclopedia of Western Gunfighters noted that though the history of these Old West gangs is often romanticized, it should not be forgotten that they were, in fact, nothing more than thugs. So I want to thank you guys again for coming out this evening. We've got a few minutes for some questions and answers. If anybody needs to slip out, feel free to do so while we do that. But if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yes?
Is Billy the Kid part of this? Or is he something?
Billy the Kid was later. Yeah, he was one I had looked at covering there at the end, but again, I had an hour and a half worth of material and had to cut somebody, so he was one that did not make the cut. But he was certainly one that kind of took his cue, I guess you would say, from the James brothers.
Native Americans, where do they fit in with these sort of looks?
Yeah, a lot of, interestingly enough, and another part I had to cut out, the Starr gang that I was talking about, the Tom Starr gang, that was made up mostly entirely of Native Americans. And Native American gangs actually started long before the Civil War, really as they'd been forced west. Many had kind of become part of gangs in order to strike back at those who had forced them west. And so of course, the Native Americans are very divided during the Civil War. Some tribes went Union, some tribes went Confederate. And so after the war, it was kind of a continuation. Now, the ones that I came across, it really wasn't as murderous as some of the gangs I covered here. They were more into stealing things and just kind of generally doing what they pleased. But there were certainly a lot of Native American gangs that seemed to be a little bit of a different feel, though, than some of the Wild West gangs that you hear about. They seem to be joined together for some robbery, but it was also more of a protection type thing sometimes as well. Usually, no. Usually the outlaws were cornered by somebody in the law, or a posse that was created to get them. And so unless you actually were able to tip off somebody and say, hey, listen, these guys are going to be here then, typically nobody saw any money. And even if you were able to tip off somebody, you might see a little bit of it. But the rewards of these sums, I don't think were ever actually given out. I think that was more to get the attention. Yeah. Yeah, it would have been a lot of money. Well, just like the Governor Crittenden of Missouri had to do, he really didn't have the money. It was the railroads who had agreed. But of course, they didn't really give Bob Ford. I don't think he even got $1,000 of that $10,000 reward. So, very little.